to talk about Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as well as the response from the U.S. and the world. And later, Democratic strategist and pollster Celinda Lake joins to talk about the National Republican Senatorial Committee's midterm manifesto, which includes raising taxes on more than 100 million Americans. All right, let's get to the news. Vladimir Putin has launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, saying that his goal is the demilitarization and denazification of Russia's peaceful, democratic neighbor. The nuclear-armed dictator also said, quote, "Anyone who tries to interfere with us must know that Russia's response will be immediate and will lead you to such consequences as you have never experienced in your history." Massive numbers of Ukrainians have started to flee the capital and other places under attack by Russian forces. Governments all over the world condemned Putin's war. NATO, a security alliance of European and North American countries formed to guard against Russian aggression, has announced an emergency summit. And President Biden joined other world leaders in imposing severe economic sanctions on Russia, which he talked about during his speech at the White House on Thursday.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies.
Ben, what did you think of Biden's speech, and how would you rate the severity of the sanctions that he announced?
Well, I think that, they've been foreshadowing these particular sanctions for some time now. And what this is the financial sanctions target some of the largest Russian banks. Russian banks have been targeted in the past, but it's usually been smaller military-associated banks. These are the really big financial institutions in Russia. It freezes their assets in the United States and essentially aims to cut them off from the capacity to do business in the international financial system. The oligarchs are the broader network of wealthy Russians who've helped subsidize Putin's corruption and benefited from his reign and kind of the lifeblood of his regime. And the export controls are an effort to use a U.S. capacity to block the export of certain materials into Russia that are important to certain critical sectors of the Russian economy. Their defense industrial base, their high-tech sector, and so further trying to limit Russia's capacity to develop and grow its economy. And so look, this will have a hit on the Russian economy. You've already seen the Russian currency plummet. You've already seen the Russian markets plummet. But these are not the most severe sanctions. The two notable things that President Biden and the Europeans did not yet do are essentially evicting Russia from the SWIFT system. That's the payment system. We imposed this sanction on Iran. This essentially kind of kicks you out of the international financial system. And energy sanctions, sanctions on the capacity of Russia to export oil and gas, which is obviously its biggest revenue generator. So this is about as far as they could go without going all the way to a place where there would either be really big disruptions in the international financial system, which the SWIFT step might do, or bigger disruptions or inflationary pressure or pressure on gas prices in Europe and the United States, which is what broader energy sanctions would do. But I mean, it's a big deal. It's obviously not going to deter Vladimir Putin, but it is going to impose a bigger cost than Russia has faced before when it comes to sanctions.
And is it right that we couldn't kick them out of the SWIFT system on our own, that we need the Europeans to go along with this? And I know that Germany and Italy at least are blocking this move.
Yeah. So you want consensus with the Europeans, and on SWIFT you'd want Japan and Canada and others on board. It does sound like Germany and Italy have been the outliers, which is I got a bit of deja vu when we were imposing sanctions on Russia after the annexation of Crimea and the initial invasion into eastern Ukraine, which obviously wasn't as substantial as the military operation we're seeing now. Germany and Italy, well, Italy in particular, was often an outlier in wanting to minimize disruptions to their own economy. We'll see what happens, but Biden made the point that the sanctions that they already did are as consequential as SWIFT. I think, cumulatively, obviously, if you added SWIFT on top of that, it would have an impact, and the Ukrainians have been calling for that. But this is still, a pretty significant hit to the Russian economy, and one that's going to ripple out across the global economy, including our own economy.
Ben, a couple of things seem true here. One is what we have promised thus far has not deterred Putin, but also that there is no appetite anywhere for the use of force. Is there anything the U.S. or the EU can do that would actually cause Putin to second guess this move? Or would SWIFT do that? Or are we sort of very limited here and he has sort of free reign?
I don't think so, Dan, at this point. I mean, in part because, the psychology of the person we've seen in Vladimir Putin the last few days looks like literally the man in the high castle. It feels like he's a decision maker of one. This is not even like there's no Kremlinology here. There's no Politburo. This is Putin. And this feels not even like a strategic move by him, but like a deep-seated, grievance-fueled move by him. Today you saw Putin summon literally all the oligarchs who were in Russia to a meeting where he basically told them, hey, look, I had to do this. You're just going to have to deal with this, right? I do think that, the energy sanctions would obviously hit the hardest, but it would obviously hit us the hardest as well. So in terms of the near term, stopping somehow this current military operation, it doesn't feel like there's anything at all that could do that. I do think, and I've been thinking about this overnight, watching how dramatic this is, the conversation is so much about sanctions. And, actually, we were going back and forth last night about the UN Security Council and what a farce it was to watch Russia chair a meeting that was called because of its own invasion of another country. And I think another point to make here, beyond needing to enforce these sanctions, go after all this wealth, is what can be done to just kind of kick Russia out of every club that we can. The UN is obviously a difficult piece of business to reform that. But there's a lot of institutions that Russia belongs to, from Interpol, which they've abused, to more symbolic things that they care a lot about, like international sports federations. But essentially, really just, Russia has now made itself, I mean, if this really is kind of analogous, it's not analogous to, but it has echoes of, Hitler's invasion of Poland, right? Hopefully not as consequential, obviously in the long run. But, this is one big nation invading a smaller democracy to conquer it. I mean, this is of a scale of aggression that we just haven't seen in Europe in our lives. And so I do think a really systematic effort to just kind of evict Russia from every community of nations and club and organization that is practical is the kind of thing that would impose a different type of cost over time. Again, it might not stop him in his tracks or anything, but I think we have to be thinking creatively about how to register that, hey, you just can't do this and expect things to get back to some business as usual. I think, some people have talked about suspending any diplomatic relations. Look, you still need to talk to other countries, so I'm not sure about that. But you saw, like, for instance, the United Kingdom took a step today where they banned flights into Heathrow from the Russian airline, things like that are just like, hey, you guys are out, that will have a big impact. And, could create pressures internal to Russia that could create problems for Putin, again, over time. I mean, this is not going to happen overnight.
Ben, just watching the scene last night with the UN and sort of just completely feckless nature of what was happening there, you have NATO, you have the world united against Russia, you have the UN, yet Russia proceeding and invading a sovereign nation anyway. Does this represent some sort of turning point or breaking point for the post-World War II order in the world about the power of these institutions who were designed to stop exactly this thing from happening?
Yes. I mean, I think that's exactly right, Dan. And, you had this whole system set up after World War II to prevent this, to prevent a war, particularly a war in Europe. Let's face it. Obviously we should care equally about human life that is lost in wars in other places. But that's what the UN was set up to do after World War II. And the way I think about this is we are in a new era that you had the post-World War II era through the Cold War. and then you had the kind of post-Cold War era, and that kind of ended definitively last night. I mean, it had already been unraveling for some time. The Trump presidency obviously was an accelerant. But this kind of period of time, the post-Cold War globalization on top of the post-World War II institutions, that clearly doesn't work anymore. And it's not working across the board. It's obviously not working in stopping Russia, but this is really what my last book was about, is essentially that order has fallen and something else is going to have to take its place. And so I think part of what's going to happen here is a rethinking of how the whole international system works, because when one of the big nuclear superpowers, Russia, completely opts out of any norms and frankly uses those institutions to shield itself. They use their UN Security Council veto to block the UN from doing anything. They use their oil and gas to leverage the whole global economy, which is dependent on the kind of free flow of oil and gas. They're using all these mechanisms to prevent consequences for them doing this kind of stuff. And then they have China pretty much backing them up on that and doing in their own way the same thing, although not nearly as dramatically. It's time for like a pretty fundamental rethink here.
Your point earlier about Putin having made this decision on his own and being all by himself on this. Like, I saw even some Russia experts express surprise that he chose to go this far. Saw reports that there have been protests in Moscow, Russian celebrities speaking out, Russian oligarchs telling Putin himself during that meeting you referenced that he needs to make sure Russia remains part of the global economy. There was a report that captured Russian soldiers were saying that they didn't know they were being sent to kill Ukrainians. Can you talk about how much of a risk there is to Putin that he may have overreached and miscalculated and the Russian people may turn against him?
I think that that's like a real risk. And, in watching Putin for years, when we came into government in 2009, he had, he was prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev was president, but Putin called the shots. Everybody knew that. But there were like power centers. Putin was the kind of guy who was the shot caller, but he kind of adjudicated between some more liberal advisors and some hardliners and some oligarchs and some military types. By the end of the Obama years, that had changed, and it was like Putin with a pretty tight circle of hardliners. And now, in talking to people, I know in Moscow, and actually Max Seddon made this point on Pod Save the World, like, it's just Putin. Like, he spent the last 2 years in COVID pretty much in total isolation. And if you watch that crazy Security Council meeting he had the other day before he launched this invasion, where he kind of went around and, kind of demanded to know what everybody thought, and clearly they were all nervous that they one guy said the wrong thing, and it looked like he thought a hook was going to come out from behind him and take him out. And meanwhile, that guy's the head of their foreign intelligence service. Those guys didn't look like they even necessarily knew exactly what they were supposed to say, and so you got to have the sense that this isn't like there's some big cabal of hardliners who cooked this up. This feels like Putin cooked this up. And I think the risk for him, therefore, is if you have the Russian public pissed off about this over time, and let's be clear, I think there's going to be pissed off Russians, and we've already seen protests today, but when Crimea happened, there were like very little casualties, very little fighting, very little cost to Russia. And Crimea is the one part of Ukraine that most Russians felt like was a part of Russia. That was a very popular thing that Putin did. That's not what most Russians think about, like the whole country of Ukraine. And so if you start to have Russian casualties, a bloody insurgency, military expenditures into Ukraine, at the same time that sanctions are hurting their economy, there could be general public dissatisfaction. But also, I've been wondering, are there generals who are beginning to whisper to each other, hey, what's this guy doing? How far is he willing to go? They're probably asking the Russian generals the same kind of questions that we are, where does this end with this guy? And these oligarchs are, losing all their money. They're not going to stand up to Putin anytime soon, but, those guys have kind of financed a lot of this stuff over the years. And so I think the risk for him, and who knows how long it takes, is whether or not different forces inside of Russia start to think like, hey, this is dangerous, And there have been leaders who looked really strong, including leaders of superpowers, who, once they start losing both elite and public support, it can go south for them. Again, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But this could be the domino that Putin knocked over that ultimately circles back around to him.
Ben, invading Ukraine is one thing. Occupying it is another. What does Russia really have the ability and the will to occupy Ukraine over the long term? Like, what's the end game here for Putin?
So I don't think that they do or want to. You heard him talk about denazification and demilitarization, which is chilling and crazy, especially given the fact that the president of Ukraine is Jewish. But we've heard this in the past. I mean, in Crimea, they said there were Ukrainian Nazis. It's a kind of weird allusion to the fact that some elements of Ukraine, were on the other side in World War II. It's obviously totally false today. But I think what their end game is to decapitate the government. Tragically, I think to probably round up and kill or detain a lot of the pro-Western Ukrainian political elite. So essentially wipe out that government and wipe out the forces and leadership in Ukrainian society and civil society that has been behind this turn towards democracy and turn towards the West. Install some pro-Russian apparatchik to be the president of Ukraine.